Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Final Frontier. Today we're going to continue our foray into orbital operations. Now, looking at the mission control after finishing that last mission, the next Exploration Plus contract is to start exploring Minmus, and while I am quite interested in doing that, I don't really have the tech to do it at this time. I need some bigger tanks, some slightly more powerful engines, and the vehicle assembly building's limit on 30 parts at the first level is really going to be what would kill me. So instead of trying to do that, I'm going to take the crossbelt contract to cross the radiation belts around Kerbin. At the same time as that, I also took a contract to test the 1.25 meter heat shield at the launch site, which is something that is pretty easy to do if you remember to do it. In any case, I went to the VAB to try to build a new orbiter. Now that I have some bigger fuel tanks, it should be a little bit easier of a task. And I also have the Thumper SRB unlocked permanently through the tech tree. One thing that is worth noting with this craft is that I unlocked, I think the survivability tech unlocks it. I might have had it during the last mission I was doing and forgotten to implement it properly on the ship. I'm not sure. But in any case, the pod has a monopropellant and oxygen fuel cell, which will provide a modest amount of electric charge, but it's a lot more than none. And so I'm adding a couple of oxygen tanks from Kerbalism onto the side of the upper stage, and that should help have power for much more of the flight at least. The pod modules are a feature of the Kerbalism mod. There are a number of different parts that have different kinds of modules that can be used. And in the case of command pods, these are usually life support modules, which include the monoprop and oxygen fuel cell, but also the CO2 scrubber, the pressure control. You can have a water recycler if you have that unlocked, and things of that nature. I also was considering putting a different antenna on it, but at this point, honestly, the fixed Communitron antenna is the most practical option I have, simply because it will be transmitting for the whole flight, pretty much. The gravity turn on this launch went pretty well, and I didn't even have to really keep the SAS on until after I ditched the SRB, which was the only stage that had fins on it. I do have a mod gravity turn continued, which acts essentially as like a launch guidance system, but I've kind of adopted a lot of the time my own kind of methodology just from the experience of having used it for how I pilot my launches, that I'll tend to use it if I have a ship that has more throttle control, which is to say it has liquid engines that can be throttled back when necessary, and also for things that I'm going to be launching a lot, because eventually I can kind of tweak the rocket to get it where I want it, depending on what the payload is. And one of the interesting things about Kerbal Construction Time, at least for me, is it incentivizes the creation of these more standardized kind of rockets. It's essentially a trade-off between getting up and out of the atmosphere versus accelerating horizontally, because the sooner that you start accelerating horizontally, the less energy that you'll have to waste merely keeping the ship up off the ground. Because if you think of being in orbit as kind of falling around the planet, the earlier that you start going around, the less energy you actually have to waste just staying up. The problem, of course, being that the low altitude above the surface of the Earth, or in this case Kerbin, is pretty soupy by space standards. I'll generally start to turn around 100 meters per second and turn around 15 degrees-ish. From there, once the craft is above that speed, a lot of the time you can turn the SAS off, and if it's aerodynamically stable, it will just kind of stay tracked right on the prograde marker for a long time. The challenge is if you're using an SRB, you might have to manually intervene to pitch up or down a bit and control where that thrust is pointing a little bit more manually. When you're using a liquid engine on those stages, or at least have a liquid engine on the bottom stage, then if I'm doing the gravity turn and I notice that I really need to be turning more, I can just kind of throttle it back a little bit, and then from there the rocket will keep pitching down, but will be accelerating more slowly. And through that, you can kind of like modulate how quick your ascent is. Usually, I try to keep the apoapsis around like at least 50 seconds, which I think is around the default time for gravity turn. Once I was up kind of in space, I wanted to double check on where I was going. In Kerbalism, if you press the B key in the map view, it will bring up this body info panel, which gives you a little bit of information about what's the radiation environment on the surface, what kind of temperature and heating from the sun you get. But the thing that I'm interested in right now is the radiation category at the bottom, which has toggles to show radiation belts, which are rendered as a cloud of kind of particles. There are 3 clouds around Kerbin. One is an inner radiation belt. There's also an outer radiation belt, and then there's a big bubble for the magnetopause, which is basically the wake of the Earth's magnetic field, if you want to think of it that way. It's out trailing behind the Earth, where the solar wind is dampened from getting pushed out of the way by the Earth's magnetic field, if you want to think of it that way. All I have to do is get into the inner belt, which is around 400 to 500 kilometers, somewhere around there. Once you get up here, it's a pretty nice view, I have to say. You don't want to hang up around at this altitude for too long, though, because it's not very good for living things. You can see in the Kerbalism window that's kind of collapsed on the top right that there's a radiation warning on the ship because it's traveling through the belt. And these belts are pretty gnarly. The same thing exists in real life, and it's a lot of radiation. You don't want to hang around in there, which is why Jeb is going up and pretty much coming back down. There are reasons to go to the different parts of the radiation belts, though. One of the things about how Kerbalism affects the entire science system in the game is by affecting the scenarios, and so science instruments like the magnetometer boom and the Geiger counter have different situations when they're run in the different radiation environments. So, for example, there's a space, just a space global scenario, and then there will be an inner belt scenario, similar to how the biomes work. And I think it depends on the experiment if being in high space or low space makes a distinction. It's very tricky, but when you think about it, the radiation belts kind of curve in towards the poles of the planet. And so even though the outer belt at the equator is very far away from Kerbin, it's way past what is considered low space, that's not the case around the poles. And so if you have a probe or something that's in a polar orbit, you can get space low outer belt science, for example. The only challenge being in that case, it's probably going to be on a probe because the radiation belts are not very wide in terms of their physical length at that point. But with that contract done and the science that I really can grab up in space at that time collected, it was time to go back down. I lowered the periapsis down to 50 kilometers, and then once I got closer to the planet, I ended up just dumping a lot of the fuel to slow down without changing the periapsis altitude too much. After that, it was a pretty ordinary re-entry down, but its looks were anything but ordinary by Kerbal standards. I did end up adding the Firefly mod, and I think in this case it's better to show than tell. After that flight, I had enough science to unlock the basic science tech, and that comes with a whole host of goodies that will be very useful to me. I did a quick mission with another part test contract that was at the launch site where I landed, just get those contracts out of the way and get a bit more money. I was looking for another opportunity to make some good science points and do some contracts. And I found a contract to get a probe into orbit for the first time, and another contract to get science data from orbit of Kerbin. Now, luckily, the probes have slots in Kerbalism for unmanned experiments, and so I'm able to put a telemetry report and another one called the Light on this Stayputnik. Also, for the sake of simplicity, I decided to just use some batteries that I had also just unlocked as a power source, and I ended up not taking any experiments that were insanely power demanding. Now, there's an obvious annoying challenge here with flying this probe, or at least a challenge that becomes obvious very quickly, in that there's no SAS or stability control on this vehicle. Even MechJeb, the smart ASS, is not unlocked yet, and so, again, luckily for a lot of the launch, at least early on, I'm able to rely on the fins stabilizing the rocket. But once I got up a ways, there was pretty much just I had to put the rocket on precise control mode so that I didn't steer it too aggressively and just kind of bump it around like I was playing pinball to keep it in the right spot. I also opted to just do a decent burn with the engine I had that is a little bit more aggressive than what I would normally do to get in orbit because I knew I had a little bit of delta V to spare, and also there's no reaction wheel on the probe either. So the only turning control authority that the spacecraft even has is the vectoring on this engine, which was why I opted to just kind of try to get as much of my engine burn done as possible in one go. You can see it's a little maybe too aggressive. Probably could have gone a little higher before I started burning this much. But once I had my apoapsis up a ways, I just kind of burned lightly until the visual effects of the atmosphere stopped, at which point I decided I could just let the spacecraft go. This is also a time where one of Principia's features is useful. One of the things that the mod Principia does is it kind of has persistent rotation built in. The physics that they're doing depends on the preservation of the rotation, basically. As a result, once I'm out of the atmosphere, I can just time warp up to the apoapsis and wait until the craft is pointing in about the right direction to light the engines and then use that torque to stabilize the spacecraft. And luckily, like, this doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to get the periapsis above 80 kilometers. And with that, the first contract is already done. The science data took a bit longer, or is taking a bit longer, because the data is not transmitting. This is another Kerbalism feature. All of the experiments generate data or samples. Samples work kind of how you would expect. They're like physical things. This follows Kerbel's kind of implicit categorization, where some experiments, I think, have to be returned to get like any science. It's been so long since I've played stock, honestly. And there are some experiments that can be transmitted entirely in one go and get all the science the first time. That's kind of the two-part rule that follows here, except the things that have to be recovered are just generate purely samples, and things that can be transmitted generate data. The probe has a certain drive size, and the size of the drives increases throughout the game, as does the bandwidth and the amount of data that is actually involved in the experiments. The experiments generate these samples and data over a specific amount of time, which is not super long for any of the experiments I have on here. Finally, all the antennae have different bandwidths depending on their size, power consumption, etc. Once the probe had transmitted all of its data, there's nothing else for it to really do here, and it's just gonna run out of charge and die, so I just deorbited it and prepared a little bit for a show. I didn't get quite enough science with this mission to get another one of the techs that I want, but there are definitely more contracts that I have the tools to do. Not to mention the basic science tech having unlocked a whole bunch of goodies, including the Science Junior. So there are plenty of things for me to do in the near future.